Scott took note of their supplies. If they left now, they'd be stretching their food supplies to their limits. Then it would only take one more emergency, and they'd be on the verge of starvation. To leave all this meat behind was not just a waste. It was risky. Of course, staying where those spider things could get them was also dangerous. So, instead of acting on either choice, he was just standing there, spear in hand, looking at the animals that had yet to be processed, somehow accomplishing nothing, resulting in the worst of both options. Brilliant. After a little while of this, there was a familiarly insistent tugging on one of his pant leg that drew him out of his metal freeze. Looking over, Alice's face was scrunched up in discomfort.
"Aren't you going to cook the food?"
Scott sighed.
Even if we cooked it all, some of it would probably go bad before we can eat it.
Alice tilted her head as she thought aloud.
"Too bad we don't have a cooler like at home."
Scott nodded in agreement, but thought about it. True, he couldn't cool the meat to prevent it from going bad, but there were other methods of preservation he could use. Methods that might just keep the spider creatures away at the same time.
You know what? We're going to take a trip to the creek today.
Alice's face lit up in a way it didn't do nearly enough these days. She watched as the large female gathered up all the carcasses they had, and both tool users left. She wondered why they didn't just scorch all the animal's flesh and consume it right away so they could use the nutrients when needed, but they seemed to have a different idea in mind. As they traveled, she tried to keep her eyes a little further back, as the female had seemed troubled by the signs her hands had left around their nest. However, it didn't take long to figure out they were headed to the small body of flowing water. So she sent some other eyes ahead to be ready rather than follow them all the way there. Once they arrived, the smaller male took off its feet coverings and started wading around in the water. The actions didn't serve any benefit as far as she could see. But the female began clearing out a pit much like the fire containment area she'd created back by their nest. Did she intend to cook the flesh here too? Why not do that back at their nest? However, what surprised she was when the female started gathering all the materials needed to make another fire. It placed most of the wood in the flowing water. Now, what purpose would that serve? All that placing the wood in the water would do would make it harder to combust. However, the female just continued making the fire with the rest of the dry wood, and soon enough it achieved combustion and had a tame fire going. But rather than place the flesh on a stick and sear it like before, it left the fire burning and started gathering saplings to make some sort of framework. The female crafted the saplings into a sort of tripod, which it placed over the dying fire, using some smaller branches about halfway up the saplings to create a framework on which it set even smaller sticks until it had a grill of sticks. The female then started cutting the various animals into thin strips of flesh, which dangled from the grill so they were hanging over the fire a couple arm lengths off the ground. This confused she. If the tool user intended to sear the flesh, it was much too far away from the remnants of the fire, but if it were to stoke up the fire enough to sear the flesh, it would only burn down the structure it had made to place the flesh on. However, the female didn't seem finished. Instead, it started cutting down still living branches covered in leaves and dipping them in the water before covering the framework in a thick layer of green leaves. Once that was completed, the female took the wood it had placed in the water and put it onto the fire. As predicted, the wood refused to combust and released a cloud of steam and smoke as it smoldered. But rather than be bothered by that, the female simply placed another batch of leaves over the opening to seal it off, leaving most of the smoke billowing out the top of its odd structure. Then, the female simply left the structure smoking before starting 2 more such structures. However, it would occasionally return to the first, adding more damp wood to the struggling fire or adding water to the leaves surrounding it to keep them from drying out too much. This made no sense to she, but then again, neither had seared the flesh of the original carcass, so she decided to wait and see the result. Besides, as the two tool users worked, they continued creating air vibrations toward one another. This was an excellent opportunity for she to test the effectiveness of her new vibration-sensitive appendage to see if there were indeed patterns to these vibrations like she'd previously suspected. Scott was quite pleased with his smoking setup. However, it would be several hours before the meat was ready, long enough that he should probably set up a proper fire to cook the last two animals for dinner, then maybe set up a camp here for the night. For her part, Alice seemed to be having fun playing in the creek. She'd found a deeper part of the water with a few tadpole-like creatures she was playing with. He called out to her.
Hey, Munchkin, I'm going to make some lunch in a bit. How hungry are you feeling?
Alice let the tadpoles go and smiled back at him.
I'm bunches of hungry.
Scott shook his head. He was pretty confident she was messing with her wording just to get a reaction, but he decided to bite anyway.
You mean you're very hungry?
Alice smiled.
Yeah, that.
Scott rolled his eyes. It was best not to encourage her any further.
All right, plan on eating in about 30 to 40 minutes.
The imp Scott called a sister grinned in response before diving back under the water. She was right. With her specialized vibration-sensitive appendage in place, it was clear there was far more complexity to the tool user vibrations than was first apparent, with hundreds, if not thousands of patterns throughout. It was almost like the orifices they produce. The vibrations from had evolved to allow far greater range and complexity than most animals. This was clearly a language, even if it was far more straightforward than she was used to. That simplicity was good for she. It meant that deciphering what they were conveying wouldn't take too long. At the moment, the female seemed to be preparing another fire. She assumed it would make a fourth smoking structure, but instead, this time it seemed content to make a proper fire like it had back at its nest, and proceeded to singe another couple of carcasses. It was so focused on its task that it didn't seem to notice when the male slipped and got its foot stuck in the muck at the bottom of the flowing water. She was confident the female would notice quickly, since its attention never seemed to wander far from its counterpart, but the smaller male's movements were becoming increasingly distressed. She considered letting things unfold to see how the female would respond to such an accident. It might even finally decide to produce a new member of its pack. On the other hand, the tool users seemed to vibrate primarily toward one another, and allowing that to be interrupted at this stage of her studies seemed a waste after producing a custom appendage for this specific purpose. Besides, as useless as the smaller male seemed, it was oddly amusing at times, and she would miss seeing its antics from day to day. Making up her mind, she reached out with one of her hands, leaping into the water to scoop up the male and get it to shore. Scott had been listening to Alice's splashing as he worked, but that had been interrupted by a much louder splash that sounded like something big falling into the water. He grabbed his spear and turned around in time to see his sister appearing to rise up out of the water, sputtering and coughing, only for a moment later it to be apparent she was being lifted by something. Scott lunged forward, intending to get to his sister's side as quickly as possible, but in his rush, he tripped and fell, watching in horror as his spear skidded out of his reach. With a grunt of frustration, he launched himself forward again, grabbing a hold of the spear, only to see one of those spider monsters drop his sister onto the ground beside the creek, its fangs inches away from her vulnerable legs. Scott's instinct screamed at him to act, but how could he move fast enough to keep it from biting her? There was no way for it to happen, so instead he crouched frozen, staring into the monster's eyes, trying to somehow convey that if it bit down, he would hunt the monster to the ends of the planet. Perhaps something of his intent came through, or maybe it was something else. But eventually the monster turned and scuttled away, leaving Scott free to rush forward and grab his sputtering sister, who was vomiting up far too much liquid.
You're okay. What happened? Did it bite you? Did it try to drown you? It doesn't matter. You're okay.
He held her tight with one hand, but his other gripped his spear as he scanned the underbrush for any sign of the monster returning, ready to act. Finally, Alice stopped coughing so much and started gasping, until a few moments later, she spoke.
No, it ... It didn't hurt me. I think it saved me.
Scott shook his head. That was ridiculous. Why would a spider monster try and help? Spiders didn't think or feel. They simply did what was necessary for survival, which usually meant eating anything smaller and weaker than themselves. Still, Scott couldn't help but think back on that first spider monster and how it had him dead to rights, only to turn and walk away after looking at him for a while, as though it had been thinking, not to mention there was no mention anywhere that he'd seen of giant spider monsters on the planet. Things did get missed occasionally in planetary assessments, but as popular as this place was, it seemed like someone would have noticed before now. The only thing Scott knew for sure as he hugged his sister was that something weird was definitely going on. She supposed the tool user's reactions to her saving the mail were to be expected. It was a little too much to think they'd suddenly understand that she meant no harm and to trust her hands. Anything that guileless probably wouldn't survive long enough to attain this level of sapience. Still, when the female had suddenly grabbed her sharpened stick and imparted its no-so-subtle threat, she decided it was best to back off and let them recover however they saw fit. At least she was able to use the distraction to steal a piece of the smoke-dried meat with one of her eyes. Upon further examination, not only was the meat similarly free of microbial life, like that which the tool's users had seared in fire, but it also seemed strongly resistant to further microbial growth. This was clearly a form of preservation, and a clever one at that. She supposed her tool users' bodies were too inefficient to store the energy in perpetuity themselves. If so, this was an innovative way to overcome that weakness. In fact, she'd noticed a trend in that direction, where all of she's weaknesses were overcome from within through genetic manipulation. These tool users solved all their problems from without. Given the nature of tool users, that was to be somewhat expected. But seeing it applied to such a broad array of threats and challenges was quite astounding. She wondered what upper limit of problems they could solve this way. It seemed clear that their inflexible genetics limited them to one body and one mind, so the amount of information they could sustain would be limited to the capacity of that single body. How many clever tool-based solutions could one tool user have? 100? 1,000? Maybe even 1,000,000? It would be far from enough to attain something like stellar travel, but perhaps these clever beasts could form societies of some limited complexity with each other. If so, she might be able to work with them to their mutual benefit. All she had to do was show these beasts that, in a way, she was a tool that could solve many of their problems, the best tool any of their kind will ever experience. Meanwhile, she was making clear progress on deciphering the tool user's vibrations. She'd already gathered that they addressed each other as Munchkin and Brother. However, whether that was a reference to their role in their organizational hierarchy, or a more general term for their particular sexual dimorphic characteristic, or even something else altogether, was too inconclusive to assume. What further complicated things was their unnecessary habit of providing things with multiple labels. For instance, when the water was flowing in the ground, it was called creek, but when it was being consumed, it was called drink. This was further complicated by the use of the same vibration having multiple meanings, like the aforementioned drink being both a part of a label for a thing and the description of an action. It would take a little longer than previously assumed to sort this mess of vibrations out, but at least she was making clear progress. After waking in the morning, Scott stayed huddled in the lean-to he'd slapped together last night, wondering what his next course of action should be. It's true that the spider monster had backed away from his sister rather than bite, but had that been mercy or self-preservation? As big and scary as the spiders were, Scott was bigger still. It seemed more likely the spider had simply left after being confronted by what it perceived as a larger predator. But why had it been watching their campsite this whole time? Judging by the number of tracks Scott found, it was either one monster that had spent a lot of time watching or many spiders that were coming and going. He wasn't sure which possibility disturbed him more. Still, the smoking had gone as planned, which meant he had plenty of food. Now, he just had to figure out how to transport everything. His improvised cloth backpack wouldn't carry enough or work over long distances. It would be better if he had a sled to work with. He could lash some branches together, which would require a better rope than the few shreds of cloth he had left from the tents. So he needed to make rope. Getting up and looking around at some of the nearby dead trees, he found several whose bark was loose enough to pull off large sections. Laying those down, he started peeling off portions of the fibrous material from the inside of the bark, then breaking those down into thinner and thinner strands until they were small enough to work with. Once he had enough, Scott started twisting them to the left until they were tight, then grabbing another piece of the strand and twisting it to the right around the taut piece, making it so the strain of untwisting one strand fought the other, giving the new cord far more strength and flexibility than the wood scraps had held on their own, braiding in new strands as needed to lengthen his new primitive rope. He was making good progress when Alice awoke. She rubbed the sleep out of her eyes as she sleepily asked,
What are you making?
Scott held up the length of cord he'd already made.
I'm making rope. We can use it to lash some branches together to make a sled to carry all our supplies.
Alice blinked a little, still struggling to catch her waking mind up with the here and now.
Carry them where?
Scott waved absent-mindedly off into the distance.
I don't know, out there. Somewhere far away from here. Far away from those spider things.
This time Alice tilted her head to the side.
But why?
Scott lowered his rope and looked at his sister, perplexed.
What do you mean, why? Because either there's a lot of those things all around us, or there's one very persistent one following us day and night. The one advantage we have over those things is we can move much further and faster than they can.
Rather than being mollified, Alice only seemed to get more frustrated.
But they're good spiders. One of them saved me yesterday.
Scott couldn't believe his sister's naivete and shook his head.
More likely it was trying to get a quick and easy meal. It just ran off when it saw I was bigger and scarier than it.
Alice crossed her arms and all but audibly harumphed.
I don't think it's a bad spider. I think it was trying to help.
Throwing up his hands, Scott lost his patience.
Spiders don't help, not intentionally anyway. They're all instinct and reaction, lack any kind of thinking the way you or I understand the word. All they do is kill, eat, and reproduce. Think of what they did to our camp. Think of what they did to our mom.
Alice's eyes got really big at that, and she suddenly looked unsure of herself.
What do you mean, Mum? What did they do to Mommy?
Scott wasn't thinking. He was scared, exhausted, frustrated, and angry, so he lashed out.
They ate her, all right? They ate Mom, and they'll eat us too if we give them half a chance.
He regretted the words as they were leaving his mouth and was already trying to think of a way to apologize when Alice took off running, tears in her eyes. Scott was so stunned at his own words, it took him a moment to chase after. She watched as the two tool users ran out into the forest. At first, she thought the female was following the male, but it soon became apparent they were headed in different directions, and so must have separate objectives. She didn't have enough eyes close at hand to follow them both, and this was the first time she was aware that the smaller male had taken the initiative to act on his own, so she decided to follow him. The male ran for quite a while, enough that she initially lost track of the tool user, but signs of its passing were clear enough to follow. It didn't take long to catch up to the male, as it had apparently found what it sought. Now it was curled into a small ball, with its manipulator limbs wrapped around the large limbs it used for locomotion, while it produced more air vibrations and leaked liquid from its ocular sensors. She'd seen something like this the first day after the tool users had set up their new nest. but this was the first time the male had done this on his own. Perhaps this is a sign of it finally attaining physical maturity, or maybe it's some other behavior whose purpose would only be made clear through observation, like searing and smoking meats. She watched for a while longer, noting that the metabolic requirements to power these behaviors far exceeded the last set of nutrients the tool user had consumed. Of course, it had a supply of nutrients stored away in its fatty tissue, though it could only release those nutrients at a fixed rate, and given their species' reliance on its metabolic function to stay within its functioning thermal limits, she became concerned that if it maintained this behavior too much longer, it would find itself vulnerable. Thankfully, the tool user eventually uncurled itself and seemed to take in its surroundings. After a moment of orientation, it turned back and began following its path back to its nest, though she noted it was slightly off course. She'd expected the male to course correctly to find its nest, but eventually it slowed, then turned and began walking in a new direction that led even further away from its nest. At this rate, it would be alone in the forest during the cool of night, when it might be unable to maintain a proper temperature through metabolic function alone. Perhaps this was all part of whatever task it had set for itself, but she was becoming less confident of that by the hour. After all, she had disrupted the tool user's original nest, and they were no longer in familiar territory. It's possible that whatever method for navigation the male tool users used wasn't up to the task of adequately orienting itself in this new terrain. As she considered the problem, she decided that perhaps now would be a good time to once again prove how useful she could be to the tool users while resolving the male's navigational inability. Having decided, she reached out with a hand to guide the male home. At first, the male seemed hesitant to approach the hand, but with some time and coaxing, it eventually seemed to relent and allowed the hand to approach. The male even rested one of its manipulation appendages on the hand as it followed she back to its nest.